Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And is there a microphone I'm supposed to lean more towards? All right. It's great to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all so much for being here with me. And I definitely would say, looking over the list of talks for this weekend, that I have the most, I'm not really sure what the right word is to describe the title of my talk, but it's maybe the most provocative, maybe the most unsettling, and I'm not sure that I'll be able to quite live up to it, but I will do my best. So I'm going to talk a little bit, basically, as that introduction suggested, about current divisions within the Catholic Church, and particularly the influence of the Francis pontificate on those divisions, and starting particularly with the way that different groups of Catholics have reacted to Francis himself. So I'm going to sort of go through a kind of miniature taxonomy of Francis's critics within the Church, to which I'm actually indebted to Elizabeth Stoker-Brunig, who I believe is going to be one of the speakers tomorrow night. She wrote an essay for the New Republic about Francis's critics, which provoked me into a blog post which attempted this taxonomy, which I'm now going to borrow from and elaborate on for you all here. So that'll be sort of the first half of my remarks, and then I'm going to try and talk a little bit purely speculatively about what the pontiff himself might be up to, what his thinking might be, and how that might in turn influence divisions within the Church going forward. So that's the plan, and then we'll have what I'm sure will be a very lively Q&A, and then I'll flee the stage while being pelted. So I think the first place to begin a talk with a title like More Catholic Than the Pope and so on is to stress that in terms of actual numbers, and if, just sticking with American Catholicism, but I think you could probably make the same point about the global Church, the number of Catholics who would count as actual Pope Francis critics is very small. And this is visible, I think, just, if you start with something as basic as polling data. If you take the most recent Pew survey, for instance, on Pope Francis's popularity in the United States and so on, the Pope is just as popular, and he is very popular across the board among Catholics who vote Republican as he is among Catholics who vote Democratic. He has slightly higher net favorables among self-described conservative Catholics as he does among self-described moderates and liberals. And to the extent that you can find evidence of sort of conservative anxiety about Pope Francis in the polls at all, you have to really dig in and say, okay, there's a slightly elevated number of conservative Catholics who say their views of Francis are mostly favorable rather than very favorable. Or you can find a slightly higher unfavorable rating net for the Pope among Catholic Republicans, but that net is 10% as opposed to 7% for Catholic Democrats, which doesn't seem like the stuff of deep, bitter divides. And I tried to go back into Pew's older polling on Pope Benedict, and unfortunately it didn't break things down quite as well by party and ideology. But I think it's safe to say that Pope Benedict's unfavorable ratings among Catholics who self-identify as liberals were much higher than Francis's negative ratings among any definition of the American Catholic right. So whatever we're talking about here right now is really more a sort of tendency within the intelligentsia, the blogosphere, whatever insult you want to hurl at people in my profession, rather than a sort of mass phenomenon, a large-scale grassroots phenomenon, or anything like that. And I have to say that I think that that's a good thing. Because sort of uncertainty with, discontent with, suspicion of Pope Francis right now is focused around high church politics in many ways. And it would be extremely unhealthy, I think, an extremely unhealthy sign for the state of Catholicism if most Catholic believers were focused on high church politics at all. given the 2,000-year history of the church and the way that those politics tend to fluctuate and ebb and flow and so on in ways that 100 years after the fact seem much less important perhaps than they did at that particular moment. So it's a good thing. At the same time, though, this unsettlement and the sort of conflicts lying underneath it are spilling out in different ways into the ordinary life of the church, and not just in cases like, what happened in Rome during the last synod, what may happen this fall, and so on. They're also shaping conflicts within dioceses. Events recently in San Francisco, for instance, I think were the sort of conflict between Archbishop Cordileone and groups of more liberal lay Catholics who were critical of his policies and towards Catholic schools and so on. All of that might have happened absent Francis, might have happened almost identically in a completely different pontificate, but at the same time, if you follow the way that debate played out, the shape it took, the rhetoric used, the invocations of Pope Francis himself, you can see that Francis-era conflicts do end up having an impact when there is division at a more local and diocesan level. So what I'm talking about, it is the stuff of high church politics, but it does end up mattering on the ground as well, and going forward it could end up mattering a bit more. But so sticking with sort of this narrow slice of people, many of whom are in my line of work, some of whom post comments on anonymous forums on the internet, sticking with that group, I think it's useful to think about three groups of Catholics who have, in different ways, been unsettled by the Francis pontificate, who are skeptical of the Pope, who may even be hostile to the Pope. And these groups, some of you in the audience may fall into one or more of these groups, so I apologize in advance, and I recognize that, no taxonomy is perfect and there's a lot of overlap and so on. But to start with, the first group is what you might call capital T Catholic traditionalists, which is to say Catholics defined by their association with the Tridentine Rite Mass, with either their rejection of in extreme cases or their strong doubts about in less extreme cases, the wisdom of certain reforms and documents associated with the Second Vatican Council. And the traditionalist camp, I think, spans a lot of different groups, from groups like the SSPX, who are in some form of, let's say, imperfect communion, perhaps, with the Catholic Church, but that's a controversial statement, so I'll be careful about it, to people in parishes that use the Latin Mass in different ways, to people who just have an affinity for different ideas and sort of liturgical approaches associated with traditionalism. So there's lots of variation within traditionalist ranks, and again, it's useful to emphasize that the numbers of people, of Catholics, who would count as traditionalists under any definition remains quite small, and that their concerns, again, some of your concerns perhaps, tend to be somewhat different from the typical John Paul II admiring conservative Catholic. And the last point would be that their skepticism of Pope Francis was probably inevitable and pretty clearly at least somewhat mutual. So if you go back to when Pope Francis was elected, right, and if you sort of scanned every Catholic blog and every Catholic Twitter feed, God help you, for reactions, the place where you would find sort of immediately negative reactions was in traditionalist quarters. And those reactions had to do with everything from his choice of name, to his choice of vestments, to his early statements, to his background in Argentina, where he was not known specifically as a huge enemy of traditionalist Catholics, but was not decidedly known as their friend either, and where he had done things and made statements and so on, just to pick one example, appearing on a stage and being prayed over by a group of Pentecostalist ministers, for instance, that traditionalist Catholics in particular reacted to quite negatively. So it was there. So you had that reaction, and that reaction, in part, and again, the sort of deeper you get into an internet comment thread, the more paranoia you find, but that reaction had a certain degree of paranoia about it. But at the same time, it's also the case that even paranoid people have enemies, and traditionalist Catholicism is associated with a form of the Mass that in many parts of the Church was effectively suppressed for a very long period of time after the Second Vatican Council. And I think it's fair to say that traditionalist Catholics are regarded with a fair amount of hostility and skepticism in certain, perhaps many, high quarters of the Church. And so it is understandable, I think, that Pope Francis's background and his moves and statements were not exactly calculated to reassure traditionalists about their position within the Church. Which is not to say that traditionalists are right and the Pope is wrong. And in fact, I think if you dig a bit into Catholic traditionalism in Argentina, for instance, where the SSPX seminary was run by the notorious Bishop Williamson, who was associated with Holocaust denial and so on, you can imagine various reasons why Pope Francis might have developed certain negative attitudes towards traditionalist Catholicism. But it does mean that the conflict here between traditionalists and the Pope has pretty specific contours, and the stakes are distinctive, and sort of the focus is distinctive. Focus has been around, for instance, orders like the Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate, who have been investigated and under a form of interdict from the Vatican under Francis, and traditionalists have rallied to their defense and so on. You can pick other cases like this. But the core issues there are potentially doctrinal, certainly liturgical and stylistic, but they're very different in certain ways from the anxieties that another set of Catholics have felt about Francis, which are anxieties associated with his statements on particularly the global economy, now perhaps on climate change and so on. So you have traditionalists in one camp, and then you have a group of Catholic writers and personalities, probably the vast majority of them American. This is a very specifically American phenomenon, who have publicly disagreed with the Pope's statements on the economy, capitalism, perhaps the environment. And in its crudest form, this criticism proceeds from premises not unlike the ones expressed by Rush Limbaugh when he reacted to, I think, I'm not actually sure which document it was, but by saying that the Pope was, quote, preaching Marxism when he critiques the global economy's rapacious side. So that's sort of the absolute crudest version of the critique. But what's interesting is that I think the loudest voices here have not been pundits and authors and columnists who are necessarily known for their Catholicism. You've had a lot of pundits and commentators, some of them on Fox News, some of them associated with other parts of mainstream American conservatism, who are sort of incidentally Catholic in their public life, who mostly write about economic issues, the tax code, and so on, and who have sort of publicly invested themselves with, sort of said, as a Catholic, I feel that the Pope is getting this wrong, or that wrong about economics, capitalism, globalization, and so on. You've had, for instance, Sean Hannity of Fox News is a professing Catholic. He is also someone who has had Catholic priests on to badger them about why the Church is wrong about contraception, for instance. So he's not the kind of figure who you necessarily associate with John Paul II orthodoxy or something like that. So it's more, in that sense, this skepticism of Francis, I think, has been more Republican than Catholic per se. And it hasn't seemed to have a strong purchase within the institutional American Church. There obviously have been disputes and disagreements among the bishops, including at their most recent meeting, about where and how to lay the stress on economic issues, issues of social justice, issues of poverty, versus issues like abortion, religious liberty, same-sex marriage, and so on. Those tensions have probably increased under Francis, but you don't see, or I haven't seen, I shouldn't make completely sweeping assertions, but I haven't seen many American Catholic bishops make any kind of statement to suggest that they think Francis's comments on capitalism, globalization, the economy, and so on are in any way theologically problematic. And, if you take what the press might consider the more conservative flank of the U.S. Episcopate, a figure like Archbishop Charles Chaput of Philadelphia. For instance, if you look at his statements on issues like immigration, the death penalty, and so on, you don't see really any daylight at all between where he stands and roughly where Francis stands at the moment. And indeed, you can go further into the Catholic press, and you can pick examples like the joint editorial on the death penalty that a very theologically, ideologically diverse group of Catholic periodicals all published together, that again suggests that there isn't some institutional Catholic resistance to what Francis is saying on these issues. There may be some skepticism, there may be some doubt, there may be some disagreement, but this division is more an issue in terms of U.S. partisan politics, I would say, than it is in terms of the life of the Church. And now, that doesn't mean it's not a significant issue, and so much of American life, as people in my profession know all too well, is sort of shaped by and dominated by partisan allegiance. So it isn't impossible to imagine a world where a sort of Republican resistance to Pope Francis ended up, over the long haul, having some real influence on how politically conservative American Catholics relate to their church. I think that is perfectly imaginable. But it's much more likely to be a sort of gradual, longer-term grinding process where, you have this much daylight between how somebody thinks about their relationship to the Church and the Pope, and then that daylight widens a bit by degrees as various controversies ensue and so on. I think that was true on economic issues. I think it's going to be true on issues related to the environment and climate change as well. I did spend the morning on the plane trying to write a column about an encyclical that I spent 6 hours reading yesterday, and I'm not sure how successful that was, but the column didn't focus that much, except in passing, on the sort of partisan implications of the document, because I think the partisan implications are not likely to be incredibly strong, except, again, as a kind of longer-term phenomenon. And I think, honestly, that the debates underlying this sort of papal-Republican divide are very interesting and very healthy for the Church to have, especially the Church in the United States, because I think that, in certain ways, one of the central problems facing not just Catholicism, but much institutional Christianity in the U.S. is that as America grows less institutionally Christian, the churches risk becoming, in a sense, clients of the Republican Party, in the sense that the Republican Party ends up being seen as the only institutional force that's really interested in protecting religious liberty. Therefore, people in the churches feel like they have to be associated with the Republican Party, but end up having very little leverage over it, and Catholic witness, ultimately Christian witness, ends up compromised as a result. So to the extent that you have from Rome a kind of force pushing against that sort of tightening association, that sense that to be a Christian, to be a Catholic, is to be a Republican, and we're all in the bunker together, and only the next Republican nominee can protect us, and so on. To the extent you have a reminder that Catholic and Christians' horizons need to be wider than the difference between the GOP and the Democrats, I think that that's a very healthy thing. And again, I say this as someone who is not likely to agree with, I didn't agree, for instance, with that joint editorial on the death penalty, and I'm unlikely to agree with many manifestations of what you might call social justice Catholicism in terms of its views of political economy, globalization, and so on. But I do agree in some cases, and I think the overall framework, the idea that in the life of the church you need to have constant pressure pushing you away from a too close affiliation with one political party, that is a very healthy and positive thing. Now, doesn't mean it'll exactly play out in a healthy and positive way, but I'm at least cautiously optimistic. Now, where I'm slightly more pessimistic is when it comes to the third group. And again, this group can overlap with the other two. But the third group of Catholics who have been skeptical of Pope Francis in different ways are conservative Catholics whose Francis-era anxieties center around the particular issues raised during last fall's Synod on the Family, and particularly around Cardinal Walter Kasper's proposal to admit Catholics in second marriages, which, of course, the Church does not recognize as marriages at all, to communion. This is an issue I've written about from time to time in my columnist amateur theologian way, which is, of course, a limited way. I find Cardinal Kasper's arguments deeply unpersuasive, and I think that their acceptance would amount to the de facto dismantling of Catholic sexual ethics in the long run. That's a fairly strong way of putting it, but that's just one man's opinion. So that puts me in, obviously, the camp of this third camp that I'm describing, conservative Catholics perturbed to some extent by events under Pope Francis. And again, I'm a political conservative as well as, I guess, a theological conservative, and so there is, again, overlap with some of these economic and, Republican-related issues. But I think myself and most of the people in this third camp regard the stakes in the debates around divorce and remarriage and same-sex unions and so on as much, much more theologically significant than the stakes in, for instance, the encyclical released yesterday. Now, again, I'm somewhat distinctive among people who have commented on this debate in the sense that I've been more likely than some conservative Catholics to suggest that the push for the Kasper proposal and other things like it is pretty clearly, or was pretty clearly, supported by Pope Francis himself. Saying things in that way is a sort of prudential judgment, and I'm not at all sure that my prudential judgment is correct. I know a lot of conservative Catholics who would argue that it is more appropriate for a conservative Catholic to basically take the Pope at his word, that these are not his ideas, that these are ideas just being considered within the Church, and simply to urge the Pope to reject or oppose them. That, of course, is then complicated by the issues of papal infallibility that lead some conservative Catholics to assume that the Pope cannot literally accept those proposals, and therefore there's nothing to worry about, which has in turn interesting and complicated implications for how we argue about it in public. But so I'm just sort of gesturing at a very strange tangle of issues there. But again, then sort of from the perspective of church politics, this sort of doctrinal conservative anxiety is very, very different from sort of the Republican Catholic anxiety about the Pope, because it's shared by so many Catholics around the world who are not at all American-style political conservatives and who have no real problem with or may even be enthusiastic about what Francis says on economic or ecological issues, as is certainly the case, for instance, of some of the African and European cardinals who are on the conservative side in the Synod debate last fall. Which is why, even though I'm talking mostly in sort of American terms here, analyzing this third debate through the lens of American politics is a huge mistake. I'm very certain, for instance, that Rush Limbaugh would be just fine with Walter Kasper's proposal. Sorry. But anyway, it's just focusing too much on the American situation tends to miss the bigger picture for the pontificate and the future of the Catholic Church. And that picture is basically this: a future in which the things that unsettle some Catholics about Pope Francis are confined to his approach to the social gospel, globalization, climate change, anti-poverty efforts, and so on. That's a future in which there will be a sort of persistent tension between the Pope and at least some traditionalists, which may remain intense but won't necessarily be that high profile, in which there will be this higher profile tension with free marketeers and libertarians, Catholic and otherwise, that will percolate in very interesting ways, but I think without necessarily dividing the Church significantly, and in which conservative doubts about the pontificate as a whole remain a very elite level, not particularly grassroots phenomenon. And that is basically a future that I would very much welcome. But a future in which the Pope's choices extend to moves that look like, at the very least, an implicit change of doctrine around communion and or marriage, and in which there seems to be a conflict not between Peter and Sean Hannity, but between Peter and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Well, in that future, the economic issues could basically become a sideshow, and the Pope's existing conflicts with traditionalists and traditionalist doubts about him would become the template, basically, for a much, much wider doctrinal conflict that would be global in scope and arguably unknowable in results, although, again, from the perspective of some conservative Catholics, it's knowable in advance for reasons of, et cetera, infallibility and so on. So, and it's that future that, personally, I much prefer that the Catholic faith be spared. So that's my attempted taxonomy. Now let me say something, without taking up too much more time, about Francis himself and what I think may be his thinking on some of these issues. And the Pope gave remarks at a retreat for priests 7 days ago or something, in which a lot of questions were asked, and this being Pope Francis, a lot of answers were given. And one of the answers had to do with this issue of sort of division and conflict within the Church. And the Pope said something to the effect of, well, the only place where there aren't arguments is in the cemetery. And I think that that's actually, again, based on my own reading of this pontificate to date, I think that's a good way of looking at what Pope Francis definitely thinks he's doing. I don't know exactly what he thinks he's doing in terms of the outcomes that he's seeking around issues of marriage and family in particular, or really any of the other issues that are up for debate. But I think it's very, very, very clear that the Pope and this thinks that it's a good thing for the Church to have arguments. And of course the Church has been having arguments for a very long time. It had arguments under John Paul II. It had arguments under Benedict. Argument is not necessarily a new thing. But what is new under Francis is where the argument is happening, at what level. Because in the last two pontificates, there were very clear signals sent from Rome that, in effect, argument was for lay Catholics, journalists, pundits, commentators, and so on, and that for priests, religious, and especially the bishops, doctrinal unity was the watchword. And I think, there are very understandable arguments in favor of that approach, but it's not the approach that Francis has taken. He has essentially said, not just to the average lay Catholic who might be arguing about something on the internet, but to bishops, archbishops, cardinals, priests, and so on, that they too should feel free to express themselves and to argue. And that out of this argument, I think he hopes will come new ideas, new syntheses, new approaches, and so on. And some people would say maybe that's a very Jesuit approach to things. I don't know about that, but at the very least, it seems to be his approach, and that in this sense, he meant it when he said at the opening of the last synod that he wanted the participants to debate freely. And so that's what's been happening. And again, regardless of what the Pope's ultimate intentions are, I actually think that that argument has been tremendously helpful in one sense. I think we actually have a much clearer picture of the state of divisions within the Church on certain issues, and also the real scope of disagreement. And I'll just sort of speak personally for a minute. If you had asked me 5 years ago to sort of suss out sort of where I stood versus sort of other people who write about these issues for a living on sort of hot-button moral and doctrinal issues within the Church, I would have described myself as a sort of center-right Catholic. And I thought that there were a lot of people, a lot of writers, priests very much included, who I would have described as sort of center-left. With center-left, and I apologize for the sort of political terms, but it's unavoidable, but with center-left being defined as sort of basically in tune with the Church's view of marriage and family, but probably pretty skeptical about humana vitae and birth control, and inclined to think that the Church needed a new rhetorical approach around homosexuality. That's what I maybe would have defined as the center left. And with then obviously sort of further groups on either side of that. And I also would have said that, that the vast majority of members of the hierarchy were center-right to right, that there weren't that many bishops and archbishops who were sort of, notably on the left. There were some who would be described as center-left, but their influence was waning because John Paul and then Benedict had been Pope for so long and had made so many appointments and so on. Now that we're in the age of Francis and arguments have been opened up somewhat, I'm more skeptical that a sort of strong Catholic center really exists, that there are that many people in it. At least, again, not speaking for sort of the average Catholic in the pews, perhaps, but speaking for people in positions of authority in the Church and people who write and argue about these issues for a living. I've seen a lot of people, both writers and clergy, who I would have described as center-left, who now seem to be simply more to the left, who have sort of more comprehensive skepticism about the traditional Catholic view, not only of a particular issue like contraception, but a whole range of issues related to the reception of the Eucharist, not just in cases of divorce and remarriage, in a broader range of cases as well. And basically, it seems to me that a certain style of 1970s era liberal Catholicism has been much more intellectually resilient than I thought it was 5 or 10 years ago, again, before these arguments were opened up, and that it has been particularly more resilient within the hierarchy than I would have thought 5 or 10 years ago. And now, some of this, you have to also recognize that the Catholic hierarchy is a somewhat political organization, and that there are bishops and archbishops for whom the question of their theological commitments is perhaps less important than the question of the Pope's theological commitments, and when the Pope moves in a certain direction, they will move in that direction as well. So there is a certain amount of that going on in the age of Francis. But there also is, I think, just a sort of deeper division on, again, yes, specifically on an issue like divorce and remarriage, but also on a lot of sort of theological issues related to the nature of the Church, the level of rupture that the Second Vatican Council really was, and so on, than I thought there were. And so, and that in turn has made me think, well, am I actually a center-right Catholic? Should I be, should I be inching in a more traditionalist direction? Is this idea of sort of a post-Vatican II center just sort of a conceit that doesn't actually have any purchase in terms of how people in their private thoughts really think? And I'm not sure about the answer to that at all. It's the sort of thing that you can spend 20 years of your life writing and thinking your way through, which I'm really excited to do. But in any event, I think that is, at the very least, sort of a important thing that's happened under Francis, that we have a clearer sense of the scale and scope of the divisions within the Church. And we have a very clear sense that where, for instance, the German Bishops' Conference stands right now is, one, very different from where I thought most of the men involved in the German Bishops' Conference stood 10 years ago, and two, is much further from where the Polish Bishops' Conference stands than I would have expected 5 years ago. That division is big, it's real, and it's theologically significant. And it's not going to go away no matter what happens at the Synod this fall or what happens in terms of the Pope's actual decisions about any of the proposals being bandied about. And that means a couple things. One, it means that at least for the duration of this pontificate, and probably beyond it, because pontificates have legacies, you are going to have a clearer separation in terms of how dioceses are run, in terms of how national churches are run, on a theological and moral level than was the case under the last two popes. And that's not a new thing in Catholic history, but we live in an era that's rather different from the 13th century or the 17th century in the sense that communication is immediate and everybody knows roughly what's happening in different places around the world almost as soon as it happens. So having a sort of Germanic Catholic Church that is teaching something pretty different about marriage than what the Polish Catholic Church next door is teaching has different repercussions than, differences in terms of, Gallican controversies in France, and it was possible. It was much more possible, for instance, to let something like the Jansenist-Jesuit controversy in the 17th century percolate for a very long time because the speed of communication was different. There was less pressure on Rome to sort of do something immediately in time for a 24-hour news cycle and so on. There was some pressure. Those French pamphleteers were wild, but it wasn't the kind of pressure. It wasn't the kind of pressure you have today, and the same was obviously true in spades in the 8th century. So you're going to have most likely this clearer division between different ways of being Catholic. And then you're going to have more pressure on the Church, maybe not in this pontificate, maybe not in the next one, but pretty soon to resolve them, which is why, and this is where I'll wrap up, it is actually much more imaginable than, again, I would have thought 5 years ago, that we could, in fact, be headed for a kind of Third Vatican Council, basically. And this, of course, was, for most of my adult lifetime, this was the thing that liberal Catholics like to talk about. So I guess it's odd to have a conservative Catholic talking about it. But, that the liberal Catholics would say, well, wait till we get to Vatican III, then we'll finally have everything, that we were supposed to get after Vatican II. And I'm not saying anything exactly like that, but I am saying that there are divisions within the Church that exist not just at the grassroots, but at the highest level. There's going to be a lot of pressure to figure out what Rome's view of those divisions are and to take steps related to it, and that pressure is going to come from both flanks of the Church. And the longer that goes on, the more likely it becomes that a pope, not this pope, but a pope will seek resolution in the conciliar form. And then at that point you can in turn imagine the word that starts with S and ends with ism starting to rear its head a little bit as well. So that's I think, again, the future is unknowable, but much more than I would have imagined 5 or 10 years ago. I think that we're headed for a sort of 25 or 50-year process in which the Catholic center probably doesn't hold, and we end up in a place where in Rome and then perhaps in some sort of division, liberal and conservative Catholics end up really, really hashing their disagreements out. So I'll leave things there. Thank you so much. So I think I'm just going to take questions, and it's 20 of 5. How long do we go for? I don't want to keep. Do we go till 5 or 20 minutes? Okay. So I'll take questions for 20 minutes, and just by raise. Oh no, there's a microphone. Yes.
Great presentation. Thank you. Just following up on your last point, is the divisions that we've been watching in the last 10 years in the Episcopalian Anglican Church, is that a preview of what you're saying might happen over the next 25 to 50 years for the Catholic Church?
I mean, sort of, yeah. And this is where my own background is maybe sort of useful in understanding my maybe idiosyncratic and totally wrong point of view. I was baptized Episcopalian, and I grew up not as someone sort of deeply involved in Episcopal disputes, but as someone whose parents were on a kind of pilgrimage through American Christianity. So we were Episcopalian, and then we were Pentecostalist, and then we were Evangelical, and then we went to Episcopal churches sort of in and out there, and then we ended up Catholic. So We did everything except the Mormons. But so I had a Protestant childhood, right? And if you have a Protestant childhood in general, you have a very healthy appreciation for the power of division within religious communities. And then having sort of an Episcopal background, watching what's happened in the Episcopal Church over the last 10 or 15 years, again, it's not firsthand experience, but I have a more personal connection to it than some Catholics do. And so I think, on the one hand, that background could be leading me to radically overestimate the possibilities for division within the Catholic Church because, after all, the Catholic Church is in many ways nothing like the Episcopal Church. However, it also could be the case that the durability and sort of persistent unity of post-Trent Catholicism is leading some Catholics to overestimate the durability and unity of the Catholic Church because, of course, the history of the Catholic Church also features a lot of schisms and divisions. It's just that we haven't had a major one since the Protestant Reformation. The old Catholic Church went off after Vatican I, and Lefebvre and some people sort of went off after Vatican II, but they didn't even want to say they went off. So you've had these sort of very miniature schisms, but you haven't had anything like the Great Schism, the Protestant Reformation, the division between East and West, and so on. But those things did happen. And it's not unimaginable that something like it could happen again. And the pattern of the debate, at the last synod at least, is the pattern of the debate within the Episcopal Church. It's a cleavage between certain, it's a little bit different in that the American Catholic bishops have a different place and a sort of more conservative position within the alignment of bishops than does the Episcopal Church of the United States within the global Anglican Communion. But the basic pattern of sort of Western developed world liberals and developing world conservatives, the tensions between German bishops and African bishops, and then just sort of the nature of the arguments being made, the sort of theological nature of the arguments being made, are pretty similar in certain ways. And I think the idea that it couldn't happen is something that is not, it's just not borne out by the facts of 2,000 years of Catholic history or the experience of these churches, Protestant churches, having these debates. And, the reality is that I expect many evangelical churches, which, when they're not in a denominational context, it doesn't have the same repercussions, but many evangelical churches are going to split over issues related to same-sex marriage in the next 25 to 30 years. That is, it's happening in some places already. It's almost certain to continue to happen. So whether or not these issues are the most important issues actually facing the churches, and you can make an argument that they're not, they are issues that are creating divisions, and that have divisions that have been very hard to paper over. And so I think we need to be at least open to the possibility and sort of aware of the possibility of, as something to be avoided, that something similar could happen in Catholicism as well. Yes.
Is it fair to say that there is, in fact, a de facto schism with the German bishops now, with some of the statements from their Episcopal Conference saying that Rome doesn't speak for us and things like that, the sort of undeclared married priesthood that seems to be fairly prevalent over there, and everybody giving it a wink and a nod?
I mean, in a sense, but I would be cautious about, I'm, by the standards of Catholic columnists, maybe I'm promiscuous with the word schism, but I'd still be cautious about applying it too specifically. I think what's happening in Germany is very similar to things that happened without ending in schism in the 60s and 70s, especially after Humana Vitae, where you had things like the Winnipeg Statement in Canada, you had things that the Dutch bishops did and said and so on, and you had a certain amount of sort of, de facto dissent from specific Catholic bishops around the world. But that didn't lead to formal division for various reasons that are both too complicated to get into, and I'm not sure I'm confident to address. But I guess all I'm saying is that I don't think it's historically abnormal for there to be this kind of not just sort of general jockeying, but specifically doctrinal jockeying between the local church and the church in Rome. But and I also think that what the signals being sent by Francis again suggests that whatever he decides about this specific issue, he is content to let that division continue. So as long as the Pope is content to let that division continue, I don't know if you can call it a schism, right? I mean, just to take the obvious example, the Pope just confirmed as Archbishop of Berlin a cleric who was associated with precisely these proposals. There's no sort of explicit conflict between the Pope himself and the German bishops. What there is a sort of tug of war between the CDF, some other bishops and cardinals, and the German bishops. And if the Pope comes out after the next synod and says, "I've spoken, the case is closed, the Casper proposal is dead," and then sets about, and then the German bishops say, "No, it's not dead," then we can talk about a de facto schism. But until then, I think that if the Pope isn't acting like you aren't in unity with him, you're not de facto not in unity with him, maybe in a sense. But I'm sure there are theologians who could correct me on this point. Sorry. I'm right.
And I'd like to just share something in the sense that there's talk, there's discussions with the Roman Rite, Catholicism, getting back with the Eastern Orthodox. And there's Urbe et Orbe is a foundation that is pushing this cause. And I think they've been very successful in reaching out to the Russian churches and the Eastern Orthodox churches, the Coptic churches, and trying to create a unity. They want to see, they don't want to have this sense of feeling divided and then turn around and try to talk to others about unity when Catholicism is divided already. Number one, Eastern Rite and the Western Rite churches. And then you start to look at the Protestant issue. So if we can come together, if Rome and Byzantium can bring it back together again, since they split in 1054, I think that would go a long way to bringing Lutheran, Anglican, and all the smaller denominations of Protestantism back to the fold. And who knows, maybe the next council will be in Jerusalem.
So
anyway, that's all I want to say.
Well, I mean, and this is, of course, one of the many theories surrounding the Casper proposal and the Pope's possible tentative openness to it is precisely that in order to imagine ecclesial unity with the East, you would need possibly to imagine some sort of settlement of the division between East and West on issues particularly related to divorce and remarriage, right? And so you can imagine that being seen as a bridge between East and West. I guess my skepticism of that idea is that the underlying, so there, it depends what we're talking about when we're talking about the Eastern Church. But I think it's fair to say that the underlying theological presuppositions of most of the German bishops and the average high clergyman in the Russian Orthodox Church are very, very different. And they are unlikely to be bridged by the fact that both liberal Catholics and conservative Russian Orthodox support communion for the remarried. That does get rid of one issue, but the underlying theological gulf is very large. So it's unclear to me that liberal Catholicism as it's understood in the West would actually be ultimately an effective bridge to actual existing orthodoxy in the East. It doesn't mean it couldn't be a bridge to parts of orthodoxy, but the bulk of orthodoxy is just much more theologically conservative in Russia in very profound ways. So anyway, that's just sort of one point of skepticism about how even that process could actually happen. But what I will also concede is that, the reason to think that schism is not going to happen in the Catholic Church is that the mechanics of it seem very, very hard to imagine. Again, and by the mechanics, I'm including the sort of conservative Catholic theological perspective on the Pope, right? That in the event of a schism where conservatives were on the sort of losing or breaking away side, you would have to have some sort of conservative Catholic theological revolution about what's happening with papal authority. And that, it seems very hard for me to imagine how that would actually happen. So that I think is clearly a point against my sort of pessimistic account.
With all this discussion of liberal Catholicism and conservative Catholicism, I think a lot of us here are parents and grandparents are terribly worried about where our children are going to end up. And I know you're familiar with all the writings of the nuns, those who are just not associated with any religion whatsoever.
Not N-U-N-S. Yeah.
No, N-O-N-E-S, right.
25% of America is now.
Yeah.
No.
So,
sorry.
Is there any discussion going on in Rome? How do you approach the younger generation?
In Rome? I wouldn't. I'm not the right person to ask about sort of the average discussion in Rome. My sense is that Francis himself sees his entire ministry as, in part, it's not just to young people, it's sort of to the entire secularized world, but I think he sees it in part in just those terms, as a kind of new strategy of outreach. And I imagine Cardinal Amali will talk with more knowledge about that later on tonight. But that is, I think, in terms of sort of the strategic level, the sort of high-level strategy of the Catholic Church, what you see from Pope Francis is the strategy, basically. And it's a strategy of sort of disentangling the Church from expressions of worldly power and sort of purging it of certain forms of corruption. It's a strategy of associating the Church at a more practical and visceral level with the needs of the poor. And it's a strategy of, again, bracketing the issues I've just been talking about, the Synod on the Family issues. It's a strategy of sort of de-escalation, in a way, around culture war issues, where the Church is not changing its teaching, but the focus and the sort of, particularly in terms of sort of how the Church is portrayed in the media, the focus is shifted to a somewhat different set of issues. And that's, I think that's basically the Francis strategy, the Francis option, in a sense, is to sort of attempt to represent the Church in the Western world and globally, but we're talking about the West, as an institution that is not the Church as it's been sort of frozen by media caricature in the last two pontificates. And I think that strategy has been, in certain ways, remarkably successful in terms of sort of immediate effects. The Church is portrayed radically differently in the media, my own newspaper included, in the last 2 or 3 years than it was at any point in the 15 years before it. Francis is personally an immensely popular figure. He is an immense sort of attraction in social media, the internet, whatever definition of sort of the emerging virtual community you want to use. he, as a sort of the sort of instant icons that he's managed to create, the image of him kissing the man whose face was covered with boils and so on. Those are intensely powerful images, and they're images that have, to talk like a journalist, have played really well in the world of secular media and in the world where I think people younger than me get their news and encounter the world. So that's, I think, been, in terms of step one, it's been very successful. The big unanswered question is just, does that actually lead to evangelization and, on the one hand, conversion, on the other hand, sort of, just keeping young people, young Catholics, engaged with and part of the church? And there, I don't know the answer. I think you can argue it both ways, and we will be arguing it both ways for a while until we start to actually get real data. You can imagine that sort of Francis's image could sort of float free, disconnected from the actual church, and people could say, well, I love Pope Francis, but that doesn't actually persuade me to go to church. It's just he's a great guy, and he's in sync with my more secular values, but religion doesn't enter into it. Or you could imagine the genuinely Christian nature. And since I've spent the last 45 minutes talking about potential downsides of the Francis pontificate, let me stress that the genuine, deep Christianity of this Pope should never be in doubt. And it can be an incredibly inspiring thing, and I can certainly imagine a world where it has sort of resonance for people in ways that do actually bring them back to the faith or sustain them in their faith. But then ultimately I would say beyond that, whatever the Francis effect is, though, the church, a pope is not going to reconvert the nuns all by himself. That's just never going to happen, and that's never been the way that these things have ever happened in Catholic history. And the thinking, if you're running an archdiocese or a diocese or a Catholic school, or if you're just a parent, as I am, has to be much more granular and everyday, and sort of, again, that's why I said at the beginning, it's good that most Catholics aren't paying too much attention to the high politics in Rome, because the real action has to come from below. Sorry, I can't call. I know the microphone is wandering, so I can't actually call on you. That's time. Okay. Thank you.